government's pledged the UK will be carbon neutral by 2050. As part of that commitment, the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles will be phased out by 2035. The Scottish Government has its own targets, net zero by 2045. But what does net zero actually involve and how do we get there? Well, joining us now is Professor Keith Bell from the University of Strathclyde, co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre, and Dr Sean Field, Director of Policy at the Centre for Energy Ethics at the University of St Andrews. Good morning to both of you this morning.
Hi, good morning.
Keith, first of all, would you start off by explaining exactly what just transition to net zero means? Because we hear it a lot. I've heard it specifically over the last week, linked to the Rosebank oil fields. Politicians say it all the time. But what does it actually mean?
I think for me it's summed up in the word fairness. Fairness in terms of the distribution of the costs and the benefits of the transition to a low-carbon economy. We can't deny that there are costs, especially in terms of the upfront costs of things like electric vehicles or changing a heating system. But there are also benefits that come from the creation of new jobs and the ongoing cheaper costs of operating low carbon sources of energy because electricity promises to be much cheaper, benefiting from renewables in future than it has been when dependent on fossil fuels in the past.
Sean, let's talk a bit about Rosebank. It's been very much the headlines this week. We're told that it'll make the UK more energy secure. What does that mean?
Oh, that's a good question. And actually, it's very questionable as to whether it's going to make the UK more energy secure at all. So, for example, the new Rosebank development is not supposed to start producing oil and gas until 2026. So it's not going to do anything for households or the UK energy landscape in the short term. And right now, we have to think about oil and gas as separate. So the UK is very dependent on natural gas. In many ways, natural gas has replaced coal for energy generation and a bunch of other things. But this field is only going to be 11% natural gas. Most of it's oil, and that oil is going to go to international markets. So in many ways, this is not going to make us more energy secure at all. In fact, the reason why we're so energy insecure, as we saw from the gas crisis and the electricity crisis over this last winter, which thankfully did not lead to blackouts, is because we've underinvested in flexible energy infrastructure and natural gas storage, at least in the short term.
And Keith, on that point, how much will the UK need to invest in additional renewables, do you think?
Well, we're talking, billions of pounds of investment. It's the renewable generation capacity. So in particular, offshore wind, but also it'd be useful to have more onshore wind being developed, and solar PV. Going up from onshore wind and offshore together today in the UK is about 28 gigawatts of capacity, increasing according to some recent analysis carried out on behalf of the Climate Change Committee to, by 2030, something like 23 gigawatts for onshore and 50 gigawatts for offshore. So, it's multiples of what we've got today.
So how far do we have to go, Keith, then? How would you summarise that?
So we need to build a kind of on an annual rate in terms of, if we kind of, did that steadily over the next few years, basically twice as much every year as we've ever built in the past in terms of generation capacity, our ability to make energy from, in particular, renewables. But we also need network capacity to be able to get access to all of that and, move the energy from where it's produced to where it's being used.
How do we do that?
And again, it's about investment and unlocking that investment. And there's also regulatory challenges in terms of, the impact, the visual impact, the local environmental impact of electricity networks, the overhead lines in particular. The finance is there, but it's kind of a lot of the difficulty is in coming up with the least bad way of doing it, because there's always a kind of a negative impact to enable that positive impact of getting access to clean energy.
And Sean, to what extent do you think that companies are investing in renewables as opposed to oil and fossil fuels?
The short answer is not enough. So what we see is we see increasing investment in wind and solar generation, but not nearly, as Keith was saying, at the pace that is predicted that we need. In fact, to reach net zero by 2050, 2045, the UK Climate Change Committee said that we need to invest 1.4 trillion, and Scotland needs accounts for a significant portion of that. And what's actually being invested is only a small fraction of that number. So there is a significant gap. And one of the major problems is matching capital with scalable, investable solutions. And so this is one of the major conversations we've been having. I'm leading this new initiative, Financial Pathways to Net Zero in Scotland. And one of the conversations we're having with capital providers and banks is that the capital is out there in the world and the projects exist, but we haven't put those two things together to make scalable investment in renewable energy technology.
Well, given that, Sean, then, and given that gap, what can be done to encourage investment in renewables and net zero that's not been done already?
Yeah, there's several sort of initiatives. I think the UK right now does not have a larger investment strategy for transitioning to net zero. There are many small programs, but we can look at examples from other countries where they've made programs that encourages investment. So, for example, we could look even within the UK, the Department for Energy, Food and Rural Affairs just launched a fund where they've put in £30 million and they're going to take a first loss position. And the idea is that they're going to invest in projects, they're going to bring in private capital to match their capital, and if any money's lost, they're going to lose their money first. We need programs like that targeted specifically at wind and other projects to get capital into this infrastructure.
Keith, what's your thoughts on that, listening to what Sean is saying? What more can be done, should be done?
Well, I agree with Sean that the money is out there, but there's a competition for it. The big thing that's been massively successful actually in this country over the last few years has been the auctions for contracts for difference. So this is a big auction process to contract for gigawatts worth of especially offshore wind capacity, and that's brought it along very successfully. We've seen dramatic falls in the cost of offshore wind in particular through those auctions.
Can you explain what a gigawatt is? Sorry, let's get back to
basics. Sorry, you're quite right. We should get a sense of scale.
Sense of scale.
So we can think of it in terms of the peak demand for electricity in Scotland. The highest that it gets at any point in the year is about 5 gigawatts. So then when we talk about 50 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, then you can get a sense of just how much of that, if that was all operating at the same time at maximum output, that would be enough to supply at that moment in time basically 10 times what Scotland's needs would be. But then to return to kind of those contracting arrangements, these auctions, the most recent one from just a couple of weeks ago failed to deliver any new contracts. For offshore wind.
Were you surprised?
We're going to have a hiatus of at least a year, and the impact then on supply chains and so on is going to be to be seen.
Were you surprised about that, Keith?
Not surprised, unfortunately. I think a lot of people in the sector had been saying for quite a while that all sorts of inflationary pressures basically across the supply chain would mean that we're not going to see a fall again like we've seen in previous auctions. In fact, if anything, maybe a rise. But the UK government, in setting this auction, had defined a maximum price that they were going to pay, and nobody came in with an offer to beat that maximum price, and so nothing was bought.
And Sean, just finally, how do you see this? And we're going to use that phrase again, just transition to net zero, progressing in Scotland. At what pace and how?
That's a good question. I think this is yet to be seen, but I think there's sort of a couple elements of it. And I think one part is the infrastructure challenge, which we've been talking about. And then the other part for our just transition is to bring all households along with us. And so, we need to offer solutions to households that are accessible, solutions that are accessible to the lowest income households.
So such as?
Which right now we don't.
For example?
Pardon? Oh, such as? Yeah, so for example, we could see examples in France and Canada where they've offered grants and such for households to go buy that heat pump and to retrofit. Because right now it's really hard to justify when a household's already struggling to pay their bills that they should invest in a heat pump or insulate their roofs and all this other stuff. We don't have a grant program that we see in place in other places that we could put in place here, which would significantly reduce energy demand and would significantly reduce households' energy bills in a way that's just. I think we could learn from other jurisdictions in making a just transition, taking a household approach.
Keith, just final point from you, just briefly, is that what we need to do? Do we need to look abroad to see what's already worked?
Absolutely. I mean, we take lessons from anywhere. And I think Sean's absolutely right that a big part of that transition, we've talked a bit about the infrastructure and the production of energy, but it's also about the end use of it, and especially the use of fossil fuels in transport and in heating our homes. It's expensive up front to get it done. I think, the grants then to be made available, potentially loans for people who can afford it, are a big part of it. But we also need access to the contractors who are going to be able to do it, and to have confidence that we can trust them to come in and specify and deliver the projects. And so far, that's difficult as well, just to find people who can come in and do it in a kind of timely way. But that also reveals an opportunity for jobs as well, and they'll be across the whole country. So we shouldn't just see it as a cost, but also as a great opportunity.
Well, thank you to both of you for your time this morning. Much appreciated. Professor Keith Bell there and Dr. Sean Field. No doubt something we will be talking about a lot in the future.